Rain lashed against the windows of the deserted station as Detective John Miller slammed the door shut. The phone lines were dead. The lights flickered, casting long, dancing shadows. He finally knew the truth. The Guardians weren't just some secret society. They were everyone. The mayor, his chief, the friendly neighbor next door, all cogs in a silent machine that had crushed his daughter, Sarah, and buried the truth with her. Then he saw it, a fresh, crimson stain on the floor, leading to the evidence room. The door was ajar. Inside, Chief Reynolds was slumped against a locker, a dark hole in his chest. And in his cold hand, Sarah's missing diary. Miller grabbed the radio, his voice a ragged whisper. "Dispatch, this is Miller. They're here." The Guardians, they're real. The line crackled into static. Suddenly, every phone in the station began to ring in a deafening chorus. The lights died. A low hum grew from the street outside. Headlights cut through the fog, dozens of them, an army of silent watchers. Miller raised his gun, his breath catching in the darkness. It's the whole damn town.
The fog did not lift that morning in Oakwood. It clung to the maple trees with ghostly fingers, muffling the sounds of a town waking to a new kind of fear. On a quiet street where porch swings stood still and newspaper bundles lay untouched, a single event had torn the fabric of their ordinary world. 16-year-old Sarah Miller had vanished between the end of her driveway and the school bus stop, a distance of only 50 yards, leaving behind nothing but the damp, gray air and a profound, unsettling silence. Detectives John Miller and Lisa Jones arrived to a scene of quiet chaos. The house, a neat colonial with cheerful yellow shutters, seemed to ache with the absence at its heart. Inside, Sarah's mother moved through the rooms like a sleepwalker, her hands perpetually wringing a damp tissue, while her father stood rigid at the window, his gaze fixed on the empty street as if he could will his daughter back into view. Their grief was a physical presence, a heavy, cold weight in the rooms. John Miller, no relation but a father himself to a girl the same age, felt that weight settle deep in his own chest. Every frantic glance from Sarah's parents was a reflection of his own deepest dread. The interviews with Sarah's friends yielded only a portrait of a normal girl. She had been laughing about a math test, excited for the weekend, planning to borrow a sweater. There were no secret boyfriends, no online dramas, no dark undercurrents in her sunny life. Sheer normalcy of it all was the most terrifying clue of all. It suggested that the danger was not something that grew from within, but something that had descended from without, random and predatory, a shadow passing over a sunlit field. The forensic search of the property was a meticulous, hope-draining process. Officers moved through the wet grass in a slow, deliberate grid, their heads bowed against the persistent drizzle. And then a call came from the edge of the woods that bordered the property. There, pressed into the soft, black earth just beyond the tree line, was a single, stark impression. A muddy footprint, large and deep, pointed away from the house and into the deep, dark tangle of the forest. It was the only sign of a struggle, the only mark of an intruder, a solitary piece of evidence that screamed of violence while revealing nothing at all. As the day wore on and the fog finally began to burn away, it revealed not the comforting familiarity of Oakwood, but a town suddenly made strange. Neighbors looked at each other with new, uncertain eyes. The vibrant autumn leaves now seemed like a garish display against the backdrop of fear. The case had begun not with a bang, but with a whisper, a disappearance so complete it felt like magic, a terrible trick that had stolen a girl and with her the town's innocence. For John Miller, staring at that lone footprint, the mystery was no longer just a job. It was a personal ghost, a reflection of every parent's nightmare, and he knew it. It would consume him until he found its source. The woods behind the Miller property swallowed light and sound with equal appetite, a dense tapestry of oak and shadow where autumn's brilliance faded into a perpetual twilight. It was there 2 days after the disappearance that a flash of color caught a searcher's eye, a scrap of royal blue fabric snagged on a thorny bramble, trembling in the damp breeze like a forgotten flag. It was a piece of Sarah's jacket, the one her mother had tearfully described, its edges torn as if ripped away in a struggle. The discovery sent a jolt of grim energy through the search party, a confirmation of their darkest hopes that the trail had not gone entirely cold. But it was the oak tree that truly stole the air from their lungs. Just a few feet from the fabric, etched into the rough, gray bark with a knife's deliberate precision, was a symbol. A spiral tight and hypnotic was bisected by a straight, stark cross. The carving was fresh, the exposed wood. Beneath the bark a pale, weeping gold against the darker, aged surface. It was not random graffiti. It was a statement, a signature. Detective Jones ran her gloved fingers over the grooves, her mind racing through local lore and forgotten case files. The symbol echoed whispers of the Ethelgard Society, a secretive, almost mythical group spoken of in hushed tones by old-timers in Oakwood's diner, a legend most dismissed as a ghost story for grown-ups. The name Elias Thorne surfaced from the town's collective memory with unsettling speed. A reclusive artist who lived on the outskirts of town, Thorne was known for his unsettling murals and sculptures, many of which incorporated spirals and archaic crosses. His property was a ramshackle collection of sheds and half-finished projects, a fortress of solitude that seemed to feed the town's suspicions. When Miller and Jones arrived, the man who answered the door was gaunt, his eyes burning with an intense, otherworldly light. His studio was a chaos of canvases, all dominated by the very symbol found in the woods. He spoke of it as a representation of cosmic balance, of life and death intertwined, his words spilling out in a passionate, disjointed stream. Yet, for all his eerie fascination with the mark, Elias Thorne had a perfect, ironclad alibi. On the morning Sarah vanished, he had been 50 miles away, giving a lecture on sacred geometry at a community college, his presence documented by a room full of students and a time-stamped receipt for coffee. The lead, which had felt so tangible and promising, evaporated in the face of cold, hard fact, leaving the detective standing on his cluttered porch with nothing but a renewed sense of frustration. Back at the station, the atmosphere grew thick with stalled momentum. Case files piled up, each tip leading to another dead end. Miller began to haunt the incident room long after others had gone home, the glow of the evidence board reflecting in his tired eyes. Jones watched him cancel a family dinner for the third time that week, his phone conversations with his wife growing shorter, more strained. She saw the obsession taking root in him, a parasitic vine that was slowly choking his life outside the job. He was no longer just searching for Sarah. He was chasing a ghost, and the cryptic spiral on the tree had become his focal point, a riddle he believed held the key, even as it led them directly into a wall. The first real clue had arrived with the force of a revelation, only to leave them more lost and desperate than before. The archives room smelled of decaying paper and forgotten time, a scent that clung to John Miller's clothes and followed him home like a ghost. While Oakwood slept under a blanket of stars, he sat hunched in the yellow pool of a single desk lamp, surrounded by towers of cardboard boxes and leather-bound ledgers that dated back a century. His fingers, stained with dust and ink, traced the brittle pages of old police reports, his eyes scanning for patterns in the faded typewriter script. The spiral symbol from the oak tree was now a permanent fixture behind his own eyelids, a shape that pulsed in his mind with every blink. He was no longer just investigating a disappearance. He was excavating the town's buried history, and the deeper he dug, the colder the earth became. It was in a water-stained file from 30 years prior that the past finally reached up and grabbed him. The report detailed the vanishing of a young woman named Clara Pierce. The circumstances were a haunting echo. A foggy autumn morning, a walk home from a friend's house, a lack of struggle or witnesses. And there in the evidence notes was a single chilling line, carving found on a beech tree near the last known location, a spiral with a cross. Miller's breath caught in his throat. He scrambled, pulling more files, his movements frantic. He found two more, a boy named Thomas and another girl, Eleanor, all within a 3-year span, all officially unsolved, all with a mention of that same cursed symbol in the vicinity. The pattern was undeniable. Sarah was not an isolated tragedy. She was the latest chapter in a story that had begun a generation ago, a story the town had tried its best to forget. He arrived home as the sun was bleeding light into the eastern sky, the scent of the archives still clinging to him. Anna was waiting for him in the kitchen, her arms crossed tightly over her robe, her face a mask of weary anger. The empty chair at the dinner table, the missed parent-teacher conference, the silence where their shared life used to be, it all spilled out in a torrent of sharp, pained words. She accused him of abandoning them, of chasing shadows while his own family faded into the background. He tried to explain the gravity of his discovery, the historical thread he had pulled, but his words sounded hollow even to his own ears, the obsession making him a stranger in his own home. The argument escalated. Collision of duty and love, until the kitchen vibrated with the force of their unspoken fears. Later, at the precinct, the tension from his home life bled into the professional space. Lisa Jones watched Miller's exhausted, jittery movements and heard the sharp edge in his voice when he spoke to a junior officer. She tried to mediate, to be the calm center of the storm, suggesting he go home and get some real sleep. But even as she spoke the reasonable words, she felt the case's insidious pull on her own psyche. That night, she too dreamed of the spiral. In her dream, it was not carved in wood but drawn in light on a dark, endless surface, and it was rotating, pulling her inward, down into a silence so profound it felt like drowning. She woke with a start, her heart hammering against her ribs, the symbol seared into her mind just as clearly as it was in Miller's. The case was no longer a simple investigation. It was becoming a possession, For Miller, the ghosts of Clara, Thomas, and Eleanor now walked beside the ghost of Sarah, a silent chorus demanding answers. His obsession was a fortress he was building around himself, brick by brick, shutting out the living in his quest for the lost. And for Jones, the line between professional duty and personal fixation was beginning to blur, the symbol from the woods now a key that was unlocking doors in her own subconscious. The past was not just haunting Oakwood, it was actively colonizing the present, and the two detectives were its most vulnerable hosts. The scent of lavender and mothballs clung to the air in Mrs. Gable's small cottage, a thick, sweet perfume that did little to mask the underlying odor of forgotten things and fading memory. She sat in a high-backed armchair, a tiny bird-like woman wrapped in a knitted shawl, her hands fluttering in her lap like trapped moths. Her eyes, clouded by the milky haze of dementia, drifted from Detective Miller's face to the window and back again, never quite settling. The light come from a neighbor, a whisper that the old woman had been agitated the night Sarah vanished, talking about lights and voices in the lane behind her house. It was a thread, gossamer thin and fragile, but in the suffocating vacuum of the investigation, they had no choice but to follow it. Her story emerged in fits and starts, a patchwork of lucid detail and bewildering confusion. She spoke of a girl in a blue coat, her description a near-perfect match for Sarah, standing under the flickering street lamp. And with her a man. Mrs. Gable's finger, bony and trembling, pointed toward a framed photograph on the mantelpiece, a glossy campaign photo of Mayor Higgins, his smile broad and confident under the slogan, "Progress for Oakwood." She insisted she had seen him there, that he had been talking to the girl, his hand on her arm. The claim landed in the quiet room with the force of a detonation. But then the moment shattered. She began speaking of the war, of air raid sirens and blackout. Curtains, her timeline collapsing in on itself. The crucial detail, the one that could break the case wide open, was buried in the labyrinth of her mind, impossible to verify and just as impossible to dismiss. Mayor Higgins received them in his oak-paneled office, a space that radiated an aura of polished authority. He listened to their questions with a placid, almost bored expression, his hands steepled on the immaculate surface of his desk. His denial was immediate, smooth, and utterly unshakable. He had been at a town council fundraiser that entire evening, a very public event with dozens of witnesses. He expressed his deep concern for the Miller family, his voice dripping with a politician's practiced sincerity, but his eyes held a cold, warning glint. He spoke not of alibis, but of influence, reminding them of the damage unfounded accusations could do to a town already on the brink, to a police department whose budget he championed. It was not a denial, it was a command to stand. Down delivered with a smile. Back in the car, the silence was a physical wall between the two detectives. Miller gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. He saw not the polished politician, but the shadowy figure from Mrs. Gable's fragmented testimony. The lead, however unreliable, was the first to point a finger at someone with power, and that to him made it more credible, not less. Jones stared out the passenger window, watching the orderly streets of Oakwood blur past. She argued for caution, for reason. A witness with advanced dementia was a prosecutor's nightmare, a gift to any defense attorney. Pushing Higgins without concrete evidence was professional suicide and would cripple the investigation. Their debate grew heated, a clash of instinct versus procedure, of gut feeling against cold logic. Miller's obsession saw a conspiracy, Jones's pragmatism saw a dead end. The confrontation left a fissure in their partnership, a hairline crack that threatened to splinter under. The mounting pressure. That night, as Miller pored over the files of the historical disappearances again, a new, chilling pattern seemed to emerge. In each of the old cases, a promising lead had suddenly, inexplicably, gone cold. A witness would recant, a piece of evidence would be misplaced, an alibi would materialize from nowhere. He had attributed it to the incompetence of a bygone era, but now he wondered. The feeling that had been gnawing at the edges of his consciousness now solidified into a cold, hard certainty. They were not just investigating a crime, they were navigating a maze, and someone with deep roots and long reach was deliberately shifting the walls, leading them down false paths and into dead ends. The mystery was no longer just about finding Sarah. It was about uncovering the hidden hand that was actively, skillfully, ensuring she would never be found. The pressure in Oakwood had become a physical force, a dense, suffocating fog of fear and suspicion that seeped under doors and through the cracks in carefully maintained lives. It coalesced around the police station, a building that now felt more like a besieged fortress than a place of civic order. Angry editorials demanded an arrest, any arrest, and the town's collective anxiety found a convenient vessel in Jake Morrison. He was 17, a sullen boy with a history of petty vandalism and a public shouted argument with Sarah Miller just a week before she vanished. He was the perfect candidate for a town desperate to put a face to its fear, a scapegoat carved from the rough timber of teenage angst. The evidence, when viewed through the distorted lens of public demand, seemed to click into place with an almost audible snap. a witness, eager to help, recalled seeing a figure in a dark hoodie near the Miller property that morning, a description that fit half the teenage boys in Oakwood, but only one had a known conflict with the victim. Then came the forensic report on the lone Muddy. Footprint. The tread pattern was common, a mass-produced design found on a popular brand of sneakers. A search of Jake's closet revealed an identical pair, the soles caked with the same distinct clay-heavy mud found in the woods behind Sarah's house. It was circumstantial, a chain of weak links, but under the glaring spotlight of a town's rage, it shone like polished steel. The arrest was a public spectacle, a grim piece of theater performed for a hungry audience. Cameras flashed as the detectives led a handcuffed Jake from his mother's weeping embrace into a squad car. His face, pale and defiant, was splashed across the evening news, instantly transforming him from a troubled kid into a monster in the public imagination. For a few fleeting hours, a sense of grim satisfaction settled over Oakwood. The beast had been captured. The shadow had a name. Inside the precinct, however, the atmosphere was hollow. Miller watched the celebration through a haze of exhaustion, the victory feeling. Like ash in his mouth, he had chased the lead because he had to, because the town and his superiors demanded it. But the ghost of the spiral symbol and the historical disappearances whispered that this was all wrong. The truth arrived quietly, in a sterile lab report days later. The DNA extracted from a few strands of hair found on the torn piece of Sarah's jacket did not belong to Jake Morrison. It was an absolute scientific exclusion, an irrefutable fact that shattered the flimsy foundation of their case. The arrest, which had felt so decisive, was revealed as a catastrophic misstep. Jake was released, his family's life irrevocably scarred, and the town's brief unity shattered into a million jagged pieces of recrimination and blame. The fallout was immediate and deeply personal. At the high school, the whispers and sideways glances directed at Miller's own daughter curdled into open cruelty. She was cornered in the hallway, called names. Her father's failure made her own burden too. Bare, she came home in tears, and Miller felt the case's venom seep into his own home, poisoning the one sanctuary he had left. For Jones, the threat was more direct. An envelope containing no note, just a single, grainy photograph of her car parked outside her apartment, was left on her desk. The message was clear and chilling: back off. The job was no longer just a job. It was a danger that had begun to stalk them both, its reach extending far beyond the station walls. The release of Jake Morrison did not bring clarity, only a deeper, more profound despair. The town was now irrevocably divided, those who believed the police had bungled the case and let a guilty boy walk free, and those who saw the arrest as proof of a corrupt and desperate department. The real culprit, whoever had carved the spiral and taken Sarah, was still out there, watching, perhaps even laughing from the shadows. The false accusation had been a red herring of the most destructive kind, a diversion that had not only wasted precious time and resources, but had also broken a boy, fractured a town, and brought the investigation's personal toll crashing down upon the detectives with the weight of a collapsing building. They were back at the beginning, but the world around them was now far darker and far more dangerous. The air in Sarah's bedroom was a museum of a life interrupted, thick with the scent of vanilla perfume and unspoken goodbyes. A sun-bleached poster of a pop star still smiled from the wall, and a half-finished homework assignment lay open on the desk, the pen resting mid-sentence as if waiting for its owner to return. Detective Jones moved through the space with irreverent caution, her gloved hands a stark white against the soft pinks and purples of the room. It was Miller who had insisted on a second, more invasive search, his voice tight with a desperation that had become his constant companion. He was downstairs, pacing the hallway like a caged animal, while Jones focused on the details, her eyes scanning for anything that broke the curated narrative of a normal teenage girl. It was the floorboard that betrayed the secret, a faint scuff mark near the leg of the bed that didn't match the rest of the worn finish. Applying gentle pressure to the right spot, she felt a slight give, and a short, rectangular section of the floor lifted away with a soft sigh of protest. Nestled in the dusty cavity below was a simple, leather-bound journal, its cover unadorned. The discovery sent a jolt of electricity through her. This was not a diary for crushes or schoolyard gossip. This was a hiding place. Back at the station, under the harsh fluorescent lights of the evidence room, the journal's true nature was revealed. Sarah's neat, looping handwriting detailed not the mundane worries of adolescence, but a terrifying descent into Oakwood's rotten core. She wrote of late-night walks and overheard conversations, of following her curiosity into shadows the town worked hard to keep. Dark, she had discovered the Guardians. The name was capitalized in her script, a title given weight and dread. They were not a myth, they were a secret society of influential residents, police, council members, business owners, bound by a single, sinister purpose: to protect Oakwood's pristine image at any cost. Scandals were not solved, they were buried. Mistakes were not admitted, they were erased. Sarah's entries grew increasingly frantic as she pieced it together, listing initials, noting clandestine meetings at the old town hall, and describing a symbol she'd seen on a ring, a spiral with a cross. The implications were staggering, a conspiracy that reached into the very heart of the community and the police force itself. Miller's eyes burned with a feverish intensity as he read the photocopied pages, his paranoia finding a tangible target at last. Every friendly face at the coffee shop, every colleague who offered a sympathetic word, was now a potential enemy. The diary didn't just hint at the Guardians, it painted a portrait of a town wearing a mask, and Sarah had torn a corner of it away. They had only just begun to cross-reference the initials and veiled descriptions when Miller insisted on securing the original diary in the evidence locker, a heavy steel door that clicked shut with a sound of finality. The theft was discovered the next morning. The locker was undisturbed, the lock showing no signs of forced entry, but the diary was gone. In its place on the evidence shelf was nothing but a faint rectangle in the dust. The violation of the one secure space in the entire precinct was a message more terrifying than any anonymous threat. It screamed of an insider, someone with access, someone they worked alongside, shared coffee with, and trusted with their lives. Miller's world, already fractured, seemed to shatter completely. His gaze swept over the bullpen, over the faces of officers he had known for years, and saw only potential betrayers. He even found himself studying Jones, questioning her every hesitation, every reasoned argument she had ever made. The case had dissolved the very concept of trust, leaving him isolated on an island of his own suspicion. The stolen diary, a ghost that proved the enemy was not just in the town, but in the room. The evidence report landed on Chief Reynolds's desk with the weight of a tombstone. The forensics analysis of the stolen diary's lock, processed with a new, more sensitive powder, had yielded a single perfect set of fingerprints. The ridges and whorls were a map of betrayal, and they led directly to Lisa Jones. The air in the chief's office turned to ice. Reynolds, a man whose face was usually a placid mask of bureaucratic calm, looked as if he'd been physically struck. He had no choice. With a grim finality that seemed to age him 10 years in as many seconds, he suspended Jones effective immediately, stripping her of her badge and service weapon. The order was delivered in a low, hollow monotone, the sound of an institution turning on one of its own. Miller watched the scene from the doorway, a spectator to his own nightmare. He had argued, his voice raw, pointing to the absurdity of it, the obvious frame-up. But the evidence was undeniable, a cold, hard fact in a case built on shadows and whispers. He found Jones clearing her desk, her movements stiff and precise, a controlled burn of dignity in the face of utter humiliation. The confrontation that followed was not loud, but it was devastating. A low, tense exchange hissed between them in the empty hallway outside the bullpen. He accused her with his eyes, his silence more damning than any shouted question. She denied it, her voice a tight wire of fury and hurt, her gaze locked on his. She didn't plead, she counterattacked, her words sharp and precise. She accused him of a blind obsession that had made him see monsters in every shadow, a desperation that had now cost him the only partner who had ever had his back. She told him he was so lost in the labyrinth of the case that he would gladly burn the entire world, including her, for a single glimpse of the truth. Then she turned and walked away, her posture rigid, leaving him alone in the silent, accusing corridor. Alone in the incident room, surrounded by the ghost of their partnership, the storm inside Miller began to shift. The raw shock of the accusation gave way to a cold, creeping logic. Jones's final words echoed in the silence, not as an insult, but as a key, blind obsession. He looked at the evidence board, at the spiral symbol, at the photos of Sarah, at the history of covered-up crimes. He thought of the stolen diary, taken from a locked room with no sign of a break-in. A frame-up required access, knowledge, and a motive to dismantle the investigation from within. Jones had access, but she had no motive. She had been as consumed by the case as he was. But someone else did have a motive, someone who felt the net tightening, who knew that the diary's contents pointed a finger directly at the heart of the Guardians. He went back to the forensics report, not reading the conclusion, but studying the methodology. The print had been lifted from the small, brass lock on the diary. He pictured the evidence locker, the procedure for handling items. He thought of Jones, meticulous, careful, always by the book. Would she be so careless? Then he remembered the day they had logged the diary. He had been there, buzzing with frantic energy, his own prints undoubtedly smudged everywhere. He had watched Jones handle it with gloved hands, but then the memory clicked into place with the clarity of a sniper's shot. Chief Reynolds had been there too. He had come in, expressing his grave concern, and had picked up the diary himself, his bare fingers curling around the lock as he examined it, his face a mask of paternal worry. The print wasn't from the theft, it was from that moment, planted not by carelessness but by design. The realization was a physical blow, sucking the air from his lungs. The real culprit wasn't a suspended detective. It was the man who had just suspended her. The betrayal was not from his partner, but from the very top, from the person who was supposed to be the bedrock of their authority and integrity. Reynolds was a guardian. The case wasn't just tearing the team apart. It was revealing that the team, the entire structure he had trusted, was a lie. He stood alone in the dim light, the walls of the precinct feeling less like a sanctuary and more like a gilded cage, its keeper the very man he was now hunting. The evidence report landed on Chief Reynolds' desk with the weight of a tombstone. The forensics analysis of the stolen diary's lock, processed with a new, more sensitive powder, had yielded a single, perfect set of fingerprints. The ridges and whorls were a map of betrayal, and they led directly to Lisa Jones. The air in the chief's office turned to ice. Reynolds, a man whose face was usually a placid mask of bureaucratic calm, looked as if he'd been physically struck. He had no choice. With a grim finality that seemed to age him 10 years in as many seconds, he suspended Jones effective immediately, stripping her of her badge and service weapon. The order was delivered in a low, hollow monotone, the sound of an institution turning on one of its own. Miller watched the scene from the doorway, a spectator to his own nightmare. He had argued, his voice raw, pointing to the absurdity of it, the obvious frame-up. But the evidence was undeniable, a cold, hard fact in a case built on shadows and whispers. He found Jones clearing her desk, her movements stiff and precise, a controlled burn of dignity in the face of utter humiliation. The confrontation that followed was not loud, but it was devastating. A low, tense exchange hissed between them in the empty hallway outside the bullpen. He accused her with his eyes, his silence more damning than any shouted question. She denied it, her voice a tight wire of fury and hurt, her gaze locked on his. She didn't plead, she counterattacked, her words sharp and precise. She accused him of a blind obsession that had made him see monsters in every shadow, a desperation that had now cost him the only partner who had ever had his back. She told him he was so lost in the labyrinth of the case that he would gladly burn the entire world, including her, for a single glimpse of the truth. Then she turned and walked away, her posture rigid, leaving him alone in the silent, accusing corridor. Alone in the incident room, surrounded by the ghost of their partnership, the storm inside Miller began to shift. The raw shock of the accusation gave way to a cold, creeping logic. Jones's final words echoed in the silence, not as an insult, but as a key blind obsession. He looked at the evidence board, at the spiral symbol, at the photos of Sarah, at the history of covered-up crimes. He thought of the stolen diary, taken from a locked room with no sign of a break-in. A frame-up required access, knowledge, and a motive to dismantle the investigation from within. Jones had access, but she had no motive. She had been as consumed by the case as he was. But someone else did have a motive. Someone who felt the net tightening, who knew that the diary's contents pointed a finger directly at the heart of the Guardians. He went back to the forensics report, not reading the conclusion, but studying the methodology. The print had been lifted from the small, brass lock on the diary. He pictured the evidence locker, the procedure for handling items. He thought of Jones, meticulous, careful, always by the book. Would she be so careless? Then he remembered the day they had logged the diary. He had been there, buzzing with frantic energy, his own prints undoubtedly smudged everywhere. He had watched Jones handle it with gloved hands, but then the memory clicked into place with the clarity of a sniper's shot. Chief Reynolds had been there too. He had come in expressing his grave concern and had picked up the diary himself, his bare fingers curling around the lock as he examined it, his face a mask of paternal worry. The print wasn't from the theft. It was from that moment, planted not by carelessness, but by design. The realization was a physical blow, sucking the air from his lungs. The real culprit wasn't a suspended detective. It was the man who had just suspended her. The betrayal was not from his partner, but from the very top, from the person who was supposed to be the bedrock of their authority and integrity. Reynolds was a guardian. The case wasn't just tearing the team apart. It was revealing that the team, the entire structure he had trusted, was a lie. He stood alone in the dim light, the walls of the precinct feeling less like a sanctuary and more like a gilded cage, its keeper the very man he was now hunting. The rain fell on Oakwood in a relentless gray curtain, washing the color from the world and turning the streets into shimmering black rivers. It was in this aqueous half-light that John Miller found himself standing on the porch of a small, cloistered cottage on the edge of the old cemetery. The home belonged to Mr. Alastair Crow, the town's unofficial historian, a man whose knowledge of Oakwood's past was said to be as deep and tangled as the roots of its oldest oaks. The invitation had come not by phone, but by a handwritten note slipped under Miller's door, the script spidery and urgent. It felt less like a summons and more like a confession waiting to happen. The interior of the cottage was a physical manifestation of memory, every surface crowded with relics of a town long gone. Glass cases held arrowheads and clay pipes, and bookshelves bowed under the weight of leather-bound ledgers and photo albums. Crow himself sat in a worn wingback chair by a feeble fire, a blanket draped over his knees, his body looking as fragile and desiccated as the parchment he spent his life studying. He did not offer pleasantries. His eyes, pale and watery, fixed on Miller with a terrible, weary knowledge. He spoke not as a historian, but as a penitent. He confessed that he was a member of the Guardians, had been for over 40 years. He described it not as a malevolent cabal, but as a necessary evil, a group of pillars who had sworn to hold up the town's reputation, to smooth over the cracks that threatened to bring the whole structure down. Then he spoke of Sarah Miller. His voice, already thin, became a ghost of a whisper, barely audible over the sputter of the fire and the drumming of the rain. He revealed that Sarah, with the terrifying clarity of youth, had pieced together their existence. She hadn't been content with whispers. She had evidence, names, dates. She had confronted them, a lone, brave girl standing against the gathered weight of the town's most powerful men. It had been in the old town hall, a panicked, chaotic meeting. They had tried reason with her to buy her silence, to frighten her, but she had been resolute. In the ensuing struggle, a push meant to intimidate had gone too far. She had fallen, striking her head on the sharp corner of the marble dais. There had been no malice in it, Crow insisted, his voice trembling with a profound, ancient sorrow. Just a terrible, tragic accident. The cover-up had been swift, clinical, and absolute. It was not the act of monsters, he pleaded, but of terrified men protecting their world. The police were involved, the mayor, the chief of police, all guardians. They had become a single organism acting to preserve itself. Her body was taken to the woods, a place they knew, a place where things could be hidden. The spiral symbol was their mark, a warning to any who might follow, a sigil of silence carved into the world to seal the secret in. They had crafted the narrative of a random abduction, a mystery, directing the investigation down every false path they could manufacture. Crow's confession was a floodgate opening, but it stopped short of naming the others. He would give no names, no specific roles beyond his own. He was unburdening his own soul, not handing Miller a list of arrests. He implicated the town itself, a faceless collective guilt. The baker who asked no questions, the teacher who looked the other way, the officer who followed orders. They were all complicit in the silence, in the preservation of the lie. The old man's energy faded then, his confession complete, his body sinking deeper into the chair as if the words had been the last thing holding him up. Miller left the cottage and stepped back out into the rain, but the world he re-entered was not the one he had left. The raindrops felt like accusations on his skin. The glowing windows of the houses he passed were no longer symbols of home and hearth, but of willful ignorance, of secrets kept behind closed doors. Crow's tale had not provided closure, it had poisoned the very air. The revelation that Sarah's death was an accident covered up by a conspiracy of the ordinary was somehow more horrifying than a premeditated murder. It meant that the evil in Oakwood was not a singular external force, but a pervasive sickness in the community's blood. No one was innocent. The thought began to sink its roots into him, a chilling, haunting truth that promised to shadow his every waking moment and poison his every dream. He had found an answer, but it was an answer that offered no peace, only a deeper, more profound darkness. The pieces of the puzzle, once scattered and jagged, now clicked together in John Miller's mind with the grim finality of a coffin lid sealing shut. Crow's confession had not been an end, but a key unlocking a deeper, more horrifying understanding. He spent the next 48 hours in a fugue state of obsession, cross-referencing every name, every minor inconsistency, every reluctant alibi from the past months. The pattern that emerged was not one of a lone killer or a small cabal, but of a vast, silent conspiracy. The mayor's smooth denials, the chief's orchestrated frame-up, the way evidence vanished and witnesses grew unreliable. It was not the work of a few men, but the function of an entire organism protecting itself. The Guardians were not a club, they were the town. From the shopkeeper who lied about a delivery to the ordinary citizen who forgot what they saw, a collective, unspoken agreement had been forged in the crucible of fear and guilt. They had all chosen the lie to preserve their fragile peace, weaving a shroud of normalcy over a rotting core. He found Lisa Jones packing the last of her boxes in a sterile, temporary apartment on the other side of the county. The air between them was thick with the ghosts of their shattered partnership. There was no accusation left, only a shared, weary devastation. He laid it out for her, not with the frantic energy of a breakthrough, but with the hollow tone of a man reading a verdict. He showed her the connections, the way the cover-up required the passive compliance, the averted gaze of nearly everyone they had interviewed. The truth was a monster too large to ever drag into the light of a courtroom. It had no single head to cut off. It was a hydra whose body was the entire population of Oakwood. To expose it would be to destroy the town utterly, to rip families apart and leave nothing but scorched earth and broken lives in its wake, all for a truth that would not bring Sarah back. Jones listened, her shoulders slumping under the weight of his conclusion. She had reached the same bleak impasse on her own. They stood in silent agreement, two soldiers acknowledging a war that could not be won. The case would remain officially, perpetually unsolved. Years bled away, each one layering a new kind of silence over the old one. John Miller's marriage finally crumbled, a structure too weakened by neglect and the pervasive chill he carried with him, the divorce. It was quiet, a legal formality that simply made official the distance that had lived in his home for years. He rented a small, Spartan apartment on the outskirts of a different town, its walls bare of photographs. He lived a life of quiet routine, a ghost haunting his own existence. The case was a scar that never healed, a constant, low hum in his mind. He would see a girl with Sarah's hair color on the street, and his breath would catch. He would wake in the dead of night, the spiral symbol burning behind his eyes, the weight of the unseen truth a physical pressure on his chest. Lisa Jones had requested and received a permanent transfer to a bustling city precinct. Hundreds of miles away, she buried herself in a river of new cases, a different crime, a different tragedy every day, hoping the sheer volume would wash away the stain of Oakwood. It never did. The memory of that town, of the smiling faces that hid such profound complicity, followed her like a shadow. She never fully trusted a partner again, never let a case consume her. She had learned the cost of looking too deeply into the darkness. Sometimes the darkness looked back with the familiar eyes of your neighbors, and Oakwood endured. The leaves turned and fell, seasons cycled, and the town maintained its picturesque charm. The secret, the unseen truth of their collect. I've Sin did not vanish. It simply settled deeper, becoming part of the soil, a poison in the water table, a story whispered to children not as a warning, but as a dark inheritance. It loomed over the town, an invisible monument to the day they all chose the lie. No one, not Miller in his obsessive pursuit, not Jones in her diligent procedure, not even the Guardians in their calculated control, had ever seen the true depth of the complicity coming. It was the most terrifying truth of all, that the greatest monsters were not the ones who lurked in the shadows, but the ones who stood calmly in the light, collectively deciding that some truths were better left unseen.